The chairman summoned me that same evening. And I went as I always went, and I performed as I always performed. But something had shifted. The performance felt thinner than usual, more like a costume than a skin, more like something I was wearing than something I was. Afterward, in the corridor, I pressed my back against the cold paneling and closed my eyes. I thought about the backyard. About one word, yes, carrying the weight of shared truth. About a 9-year-old sitting between us like a small living declaration of something uncomplicated and real. I thought about how no one in this house, not Madame Zhang, not the chairman, not the gold-toothed man, had ever looked at me the way Yonho looked at me. Not as inventory, not as a transaction, not as a debt settled or a name in a ledger. As something genuinely, specifically, inconveniently interesting. I pushed off the wall. I straightened my shirt. I walked to my room. I did not sleep. The summer deepened. Days accumulated the way they do when you are no longer counting toward an exit. Differently, with more texture, the hours heavier and also somehow more real. I learned the mansion's rhythms the way you learn a difficult piece of music. Not by understanding it, but by repeating it until your body knows which way to move before your mind does. I learned that the chairman ate alone when he was in a dark mood and summoned me when he was in a different kind of mood, and that reading the difference between these states was a survival skill I had become very good at. I learned that the servants moved in precise orbits that rarely intersected with mine in the backyard or the library. I learned that Yinwu would appear wherever I was if given the opportunity, and that his small serious presence was the closest thing to uncomplicated this house contained. And I learned, against every reasonable intention I had, the particular geography of Ryu Yonho. That he smoked most heavily in the morning and least at night. That he was in the library when he was avoiding something and in the backyard when he had stopped avoiding it. That he watched his younger brother with a gentleness so different from his default expression that seeing it the first time felt like walking through a door into a different building. That he spoke carefully and sparsely, and that every word he chose to use was the right one, which meant his silences were as precise as his speech. That when he looked at me, specifically at me, not at the performance or the pheromones or the white shirt, his eyes carried something that I had no safe name for and had been trying very hard not to examine directly. I was examining it directly. I was doing it constantly. I was doing it right now, sitting 3 meters away from him in the backyard on a Tuesday afternoon, while the cicadas made their noise and the summer light slanted gold across the weeds. "Stop," I said. "Stop what?" he said, looking at me like that. He was quiet for a moment. "Like what?" he asked, with the specific innocence of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. "Like you're trying to figure something out." "I am," he said. "Figure it out somewhere else. I find this location convenient." I pulled my knees closer to my chest. My pheromone shimmer spiked and I let it. The irritation was genuine and suppressing it required effort I didn't feel like spending today. "What is it you think you're figuring out?" I asked, and immediately wished I hadn't, because questions invite answers and I was not sure I was ready for his. He turned to look at me fully. Not the side glance, not the peripheral hunting attention. Full, direct, the heavy-lidded eyes carrying something steady and considered. "Why you're still here," he said. The words landed differently than I expected. Not an accusation, a genuine question. As though he had looked at all the evidence. The lake, the photographs in the study, the performance I ran every day for his father, and arrived at a puzzle he couldn't resolve. "I don't have a choice," I said. "Everyone has a choice," he said. "You've never not had one," I said. "That's why you can say that." The silence that followed was different from the others. Fuller. Something in it that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. The silence of two people who have said something true and are sitting with the fact of it. "No," he said finally, quietly. "That's fair." I looked at him, and the thing I had been trying not to examine directly examined itself all at once with no consideration for my preferences, because Ryu Yonho had just admitted he was wrong about something. Had heard a correction and accepted it. Had said that's fair with the ease of someone unburdened by the need to win. In this house where every interaction was a transaction and every kindness was a down payment and every look was an appraisal. That's fair. I looked back at the weeds. My hands were not shaking. I wished, briefly, that they were. It would have been easier to dismiss as simple fear. It was Yinwoo who broke the pattern. He came running to the backyard one afternoon faster than his usual deliberate walk, sketchbook clutched to his chest, and he looked at his brother with the specific expression of a child delivering news that is both urgent and confusing. "Father is asking for Siramesasai," he said, slightly breathless. Yonho's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. A slight cooling, a reorganization, the careful neutrality of someone setting aside whatever they were thinking and replacing it with something more functional. "Go," he said to me. Not dismissive. Something more careful than that. I stood. I brushed my shorts. I felt the weight of both of them watching me walk back toward the mansion. Yinwoo with his open curious face and his sketchbook and his uncomplicated worry, and Yonho with his cigarette and his eyes that had just said "that's fair" and his presence that I could feel on my back all the way to the door. I went inside. I performed. I was very good at it. But something had changed, something small and structural and irreversible, like the first crack in a wall that looks solid, and I could feel it in the space behind my ribs where the performance used to sit undisturbed. That night I lay on the carved post bed and looked at the ceiling, which was Yonho's floor, and I allowed myself, for the first time since arriving at this mansion, to ask the question I had been very carefully not asking. What if I didn't disappear? Not forever. Not as a plan. Just as a question. As a hypothetical held at arm's length and examined without committing to it. What if I stayed? What if the plan I had built in the dark hours before dawn, the lake, the pier, the clean trail, the erasure of Baekseol Rim, what if that plan had been wrong? Not wrong because my body refused it, not wrong because a man's hand reached into the water, but wrong because it assumed that nothing here was worth remaining for. What if that assumption was wrong? I heard a sound above me. Footsteps on the wooden floor, Yonho moving in his room directly above mine. A pause. Then stillness. I pressed my palm against the ceiling. Cold plaster. The boundary between his space and mine. I thought about "that's fair." I thought about your interesting delivered without agenda, without transaction, without the grammar of ownership. I thought about the lake and the grip, and the too large dark sleep shirt that smelled of cigarette smoke and something clean and sharp that I had folded and put in the back of the wardrobe instead of returning because I was not ready to examine why. I moved my hand away from the ceiling. I closed my eyes. Outside the window, the summer night was full of cicadas singing themselves to death for the chance to exist. And I lay in the dark of a mansion that was trying to own me and thought about a man who had reached into deep water without asking permission and pulled me back into the world whether I wanted it or not. And somewhere between one breath and the next, without deciding to, I was glad he had.